The good news is the air conditioning turned on. The bad news, if it didn't turn on and if it was broke or something, I wasn't going to give a homily. So pluses and minuses to that. But today we celebrate the Assumption of our Blessed Mother into heaven. And I think as Catholics, it gives us, it's kind of one of those days where, maybe if someone who's not Catholic asks you, where are you going tonight? It's, you're going to Mass on a Wednesday? What's going on with that? And then, it's like, well, we celebrate the Assumption of the Blessed Mother. Like, what'd you just say? The Assumption of the Blessed Mother. We already take a lot of hits, I think, a lot of times because what we believe the Blessed Mother is and how we approach her is misunderstood, obviously, by lots of people. And then you have a day like today, which is where we celebrate her Assumption into heaven. And then people give us a lot of grief about that, too. Because people will say, well, where was that recorded? Where was it written down that our Blessed Mother, that Mary, was assumed into heaven? That's not anywhere in Scripture. And I think it's a really hard thing for people to get, especially in our own day. We live in a culture and in a society that really tends to doubt things and to be suspicious of things. Everything is a deception or an attempt to lead us astray or an attempt to confuse unless it's proven otherwise. It's guilty until proven innocent. When somebody says, gives you their word, we very often doubt that. We are suspicious of that. And then you have things like the Da Vinci Code and all these other things that sort of, the Catholic Church then becomes the ultimate form of deception and secret keeping and trying to lead everyone astray and make things up and so on and so forth. And this just becomes another one of those things. The Blessed Mother was assumed into heaven. Somebody probably, people say, somebody probably made that up. Somebody probably made that up a long time ago and just thought, hey, that's a nice thing. We'll celebrate that. Another reason to have a collection or something. That's what pessimistic people would say, and we live in sort of a pessimistic society. And I think that's obviously a really sad thing, because a lot of the things that we celebrate in our faith are things that were handed on to us from previous generations. From even generations, thousands of years ago, the apostles handed the faith on to the next generation, and that generation handed it on to the next. And for a lot of that time, at least in the early church, there was no Bible. There was nothing written down. And yet people trusted one another. They assumed when they heard from somebody else, and they heard from lots of different people, hey, we all knew the apostles. And they all talked about how the Blessed Mother was assumed into heaven. And we didn't write it down. We didn't get it stamped by the magistrate and 4 witnesses to sign that we saw the Blessed Mother assumed into heaven on October 13th of 40 A.D. We didn't make a court record of it or anything like that. We just trust each other. This is what happened. But we miss out, I think, when we take the skeptical or the pessimistic approach of many people today that, well, if you can't prove it, if you can't prove with science, if it wasn't videoed, if you couldn't measure it or whatever, however you want to study, if you can't prove it that way, then most people will say, well, then I'm not going to put my faith in that. I'm not going to believe that. And again, we miss out on so much when we take that approach. And really, our faith would have never gotten off the ground. The Catholic Church would have never gotten off the ground if we didn't trust the people that came before us. So I can point to you and say, well, it was written down in this date, and this Pope started the celebration and started having Mass for it in this date. But if we don't trust the previous generations, then really what good does that do? And sort of maybe as a quick story to illustrate the power of the ability to pass the faith on from one generation to the next, I wanted to just tell you about it. I was reflecting a few weeks ago about a time that I spent in Rome studying. And one of the coolest things I got to do when I was in Rome was a little thing called the Scavi tour. Scavi is Italian for basically like excavation. And so you have like the main floor of St. Peter's Basilica, and then you have the crypt, the next floor, the kind of the basement. And then the rumor, the story that had been handed on from generation to generation was that St. Peter's Basilica was built on top of Constantine's Basilica, which he built in 300. And there was all these, so this site has been holy. Well, no one was sure anymore. No one was like, well, everybody's like, well, that was a kind of a pious legend, but we don't really know what's down there, and maybe there's nothing. And so I believe it was Pope Pius XII commissioned in the middle of the 1900s, commissioned a group of archaeologists to go down beneath the crypt, kind of into the dirt underneath St. Peter's Basilica, and start doing some excavating. But they had to do it in secret because the Nazis were in town and occupying Rome at the time. And so they were doing this in secret. But what they started finding was, in fact, they started finding these crypts, these underground sort of burial sites where the first Christians had worshipped. In some of these house churches and burial sites and so on and so forth, right there where everyone had said they would be. And what they kept doing is they kept working closer, and they kept going deeper and further, through the church. And another thing that had always been sort of spoken, passed on from generation to generation, was the idea that the altar in St. Peter's Basilica was directly above the bones of St. Peter. But again, everyone at this point in time, 2,000 years later, was like, oh, that sounds more like a pious legend. That sounds like something that maybe people had made up. And so most people actually doubted it and didn't believe it. But what they found is they dug closer and closer, and they got closer and closer to beneath the altar. They started seeing signs and coded things, coded messages that only the Christians would get, that was saying, basically, Peter is buried near here. And they got right underneath the altar, and they found again some messages that indicated, here lies Peter, here lies the rock of the church. And they went inside there, and they found a collection of bones in sort of a coffin type of a thing. They did dating on the bones, and the bones dated to 50 or 60 AD, exactly when St. Peter was alive. And they said that if you drop a laser sight from the center of the altar of Peter's Basilica directly down beneath the floor, it hits where they found St. Peter's bones. And there again, just one of numerous stories, numerous illustrations of how our faith is passed on from generation to generation. Can I show you a video of our Blessed Mother being assumed into heaven? No. Are there court records? No. Is it in Scripture? No. But does that mean it's not true and that it didn't happen? Absolutely not. And so tonight we celebrate, obviously, our Blessed Mother clearing the way, showing us the way after her Son to lead and to go into heaven. But we also celebrate the gift of our faith, the gift that it's handed on from one generation to another. The baton is passed from one to the next. And we trust them, and we give thanks for their witness. We give thanks that they trusted one another enough to hand on the faith. And that they, unlike our culture today, were not skeptical and doubted, but instead chose to establish our faith, which we stand on this night.